September 26, 1983. A secret Soviet bunker outside Moscow. Rows of cold concrete, fluorescent lights, silence. Another quiet night during the Cold War, or so it seemed. The world was tense. NATO and the USSR stood on the edge, both armed with nuclear weapons. One mistake, one false alarm could start a war no one could stop. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat on duty, responsible for confirming missile launch warnings. If an attack was detected, he must report it. The next steps could trigger a nuclear response. Just past midnight, everything changed. A piercing alarm. On the screen, launch detected. A US missile heading toward the Soviet Union, and another. 5 total. The computer labeled it 100% confirmed attack. Protocol required him to report it immediately. A single word. And the Soviet response could be nuclear. In that moment, one man held the fate of millions. Petrov hesitated. Satellite could be wrong. But if he waited, and it was real, there would be no second chance. He made a decision. He reported the alert as false, a choice that defied protocol and prevented nuclear retaliation. Fade to black. For nearly 4 decades, the Cold War had shaped the world. 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, lived in a state of constant distrust. Both sides armed themselves faster than they could sign treaties. With nuclear weapons came a new kind of logic. If one side launched first, the other would respond, and no one would win. This idea became known as mutually assured destruction. In theory, this balance prevented war. In reality, it depended on flawless systems and perfect human judgment. And neither was guaranteed. By the early 1980s, tensions were rising again. US President Ronald Reagan publicly called the Soviet Union an evil empire. Both sides deployed new missiles across Europe. The year 1983 was especially dangerous. The United States announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a plan to build a space-based missile defense system. In Moscow, it was seen as a threat to the nuclear balance. That same year, a civilian tragedy deepened mistrust. Korean Airlines. Flight 007 entered Soviet airspace and was shot down. All 269 people on board were killed. In the fall, NATO prepared for a large military exercise, Able Archer. Inside the Soviet leadership, fears grew that the exercise could mask a real nuclear attack. Every radar system, every satellite, every warning signal operated under extreme pressure. One false reading could trigger a chain reaction. It was in this atmosphere of fear and mistrust that Stanislav Petrov began his shift in September 1983. A world that hoped war would never come, but prepared for it as if it was inevitable. In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was completing the deployment of a new early warning system for nuclear attacks. It was called OKO, the Eye. Its purpose was simple in theory: detect an American nuclear missile launch within minutes and give the country time to respond. For the first time, the warning would come not from the ground, but from space. The system relied on satellites equipped with infrared sensors. From high-altitude orbits, they monitored parts of the United States. When a missile launched, its engines produced an intense heat signature. The sensors were designed to detect that flash, a small but distinctive point of light against the darkness of Earth. Once a signal was detected, algorithms analyzed its shape, brightness, and movement. If the data matched the expected profile of a missile launch, the system generated an alert. On paper, it was precise, but it depended on interpretation, light patterns, angles, reflections, not on direct visual confirmation. Before OKO, early warning depended on ground-based radar. Radars could only see missiles once they were already airborne. Space-based detection promised something new: time. A few additional minutes to evaluate a threat and decide how to respond. But the system had a weakness. It was new, largely untested, and it did not see missiles directly. It interpreted light, a tiny signal, measured against an enormous background. In theory, the software could distinguish a missile plume from sunlight. In practice, certain conditions were difficult. When the sun aligned at specific angles, reflections off clouds could resemble a launch. These edge cases were known, but not fully resolved. The system produced automated conclusions: probable attack, partially confirmed attack, or false alarm. But the final decision was not made by software. A duty officer received the alert. His task was to decide whether the warning should be reported up the chain of command. This human judgment was the final filter between a system error and a national response. On that night in 1983, the duty officer was Stanislav Petrov, a lieutenant colonel, not a passive operator, but the person required to make a decision that could not be undone. If the warning went forward, control would pass to higher command, and the clock would start. Such decisions were measured in minutes, sometimes less. The OCO system was built to prevent surprise attacks. Instead, it would generate a warning that placed the world at a point of choice, and that choice would depend on one person, unsure of everything except the cost of being wrong. Petrov's night shift began like any other. It was already past midnight. Inside the early warning center, the atmosphere was calm. Satellite data arrived as usual. Operators logged routine signals. The system functioned within normal parameters. Nothing suggested that this night would be different. Then, without warning, the silence was broken. A sharp alarm cut through the room. On the central screen, a red message appeared. Missile launch detected from the United States. According to protocol, the meaning was clear. The satellite system had detected the heat signature of a missile launch. Petrov's console lit up with a red indicator, the highest threat level. If confirmed, the information would be forwarded directly to Soviet High Command. At first, the system reported a single missile, just one. That detail immediately stood out. A real nuclear attack would not begin with a single launch, not strategically, not historically. The system did not question the logic of war. It only measured signals: light, heat, movement. It did not think. It classified. Then the data changed. A second launch appeared, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. The system now reported multiple Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles. Confidence levels rose from caution to near certainty. According to procedure, Petrov was expected to report the alert immediately. Once reported, the decision would move beyond his control. From that moment on, the chain of command would take over, and the clock would begin. Inside the command center, no one spoke. Operators watched their screens. They watched Petrov. They watched the red indicators. Everyone understood the stakes. An error in either direction could be final. Petrov had only minutes, maybe 2, maybe 3, no more. If the system was wrong and he reported it, the consequences could be catastrophic. If the system was right and he did not, the consequences could be the same. What had begun as a routine shift had become a moment where a single decision outweighed every written instruction. The system had spoken. Now, a human had to answer. Petrov was required to report the alert. The protocol was unambiguous. If an incoming missile launch was detected, the officer on duty had to notify higher command immediately. No discussion. No independent analysis. From that point on, decisions would be made far above this room. But Petrov did not pick up the phone. Instead, Petrov tried to understand whether the screens were showing reality or a failure inside the system itself. This was not panic. It was doubt. During training, officers had been told the same thing repeatedly. If a nuclear war began, it would not begin with a handful of missiles. It would be massive. Hundreds, possibly thousands. a coordinated strike designed to destroy the enemy's response before it could launch. But the system was showing 5 missiles. 5 was not enough to start a war. It made no strategic sense. Petrov asked the operators to recheck the data. The system confirmed the alert. Confidence levels remained high. According to the machine, this was an attack. Command was waiting for his report. Time was passing. Every second increased the pressure to follow procedure. Petrov understood the consequences of both choices. If he reported a false attack, a nuclear response could be launched against a country that had done nothing. A global war triggered by error. If he failed to report a real attack, nuclear warheads could reach Soviet cities within 20 to 30 minutes. Millions could die. Either decision carried irreversible risk. Inside the control room, no one spoke. The operators watched their screens. They watched Petrov. The decision belonged to one person. Petrov stepped away from the console. He turned his back to the red lights. In front of him was no longer a screen, but a question about responsibility. A simple thought surfaced. If the United States had truly launched a nuclear war, there was nothing he could change. But if the system was wrong and he followed it blindly, he would become part of a mistake that could destroy the world. Petrov chose to wait. Minutes passed. They felt endless. He reported upward that the alert was false, that confirmation was insufficient, that observation should continue. This was not a heroic act. It was not emotional. It was the decision of an engineer who understood that systems can fail. And in that quiet moment, the world continued. If Stanislav Petrov had followed the protocol exactly, the night could have unfolded very differently. The regulations were clear and unemotional. If a missile launch was confirmed, the duty officer was required to report it up the chain of command. There was no room for interpretation, no pause for debate. Once the report was made, a process would begin that was almost impossible to stop. This system was designed for speed, not for doubt. The sequence was straightforward. First, the alert would be transmitted to the Missile Attack Warning Center. From there, the report would move to the General Staff, and then to the political leadership. At that point, decisions would need to be made in minutes, sometimes in seconds. Once the message reached the top, the system no longer belonged to one man. In 1983, Soviet nuclear doctrine was based on one assumption. If an attack was real, a retaliatory strike had to be launched before incoming missiles reached their targets, before silos were destroyed, before command centers were lost, before communication lines were cut. There was no concept of waiting for confirmation after impact. The window for response was 5 to 10 minutes at most, often less. Had the warning been passed upward without hesitation, the likelihood of a retaliatory launch would have been extremely high. Political relations between the superpowers were at one of their lowest points. Trust was minimal. Fear was institutionalized. In that climate, a warning was not treated as a hypothesis, it was treated as a threat. Analysts later estimated that a full-scale nuclear exchange would have launched thousands of warheads into the air. Targets would not have been limited to capitals, industrial centers, airfields, ports, energy infrastructure, Moscow, Leningrad, Kyiv, Washington, New York, Chicago, and hundreds of other cities. Immediate casualties would have numbered in the tens of millions. In the weeks that followed, the situation would worsen. Radiation, food shortages, medical collapse, the breakdown of communication and transport. Some experts at the time used a stark phrase: the impossibility of restoring civilization within any foreseeable time frame. Nuclear winter was not a metaphor. It was a scientific model. Massive fires would have pushed soot into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight. Global temperatures would drop. Crop yields would fail. Ecosystems would collapse. Survival would not depend on borders. No country would be untouched. None of this required a malfunctioning missile, only a report, a single statement made into a telephone. In 1983, the world stood one decision away from irreversible consequences. That decision was not made by a committee, not by a government. It was made by one man standing in front of screens glowing red. After the alert ended, the station returned to normal operations. The sirens stopped. No launches followed. On the surface, nothing had happened. But those who were in the control room that night understood how close the system had come to a point of no return. The world continued as usual, unaware that a single decision had quietly held everything together. Stanislav Petrov filed his official report. It was written plainly, without drama. By procedure, he had violated protocol. He made a decision without confirmation. In practice, he prevented a catastrophe. But inside a system built on strict obedience, initiative did not look like heroism. It looked like deviation. An internal commission reviewed the incident. The focus was not on the disaster that did not happen. It was on procedure. The conclusion was clear. The officer failed to follow reporting protocol and made errors in the observation log. Formally, this was grounds for reprimand. The documents were classified. The incident was not discussed publicly. No reforms followed. No training manuals were rewritten. No lessons were shared. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union could not admit that its early warning system was vulnerable. To acknowledge uncertainty was to reveal weakness, and weakness was considered a political risk. Petrov continued his service, but his career did not advance. There were no awards, no interviews, no public recognition. After several years, he quietly retired. To the system, he was not a hero. He was simply an officer who did not fit neatly into procedure. Decades later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the story emerged. Archived documents were partially declassified. Western researchers began studying the incident. Only then did the world learn the name of the man who once said no when everything demanded yes. That night did not change history because of what happened. It mattered because of what did not. With a single decision, Stanislav Petrov altered a possible path of the world, not through authority, not through force, but through judgment. For nearly 15 years, no one outside the Soviet military knew this story. There were no newspaper articles, no television reports, no public records of the night when a single decision prevented escalation. The name of the officer involved did not appear anywhere. The incident remained buried inside classified archives, known only to a small circle within the system that produced it. In 1998, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, parts of the military archives were declassified. That same year, former Air Defense Commander General Yuri Votintsev published his memoirs. In one chapter, he briefly mentioned an incident at the Serpukhov 15 early warning station, where a duty officer used judgment and prevented escalation. No name was given, but for the first time, the silence was broken. Journalists took notice. Researchers studying the Cold War began tracing the reference. Letters were sent. Requests followed. Slowly, details emerged. The officer was identified. His name was Stanislav Petrov. Western journalists and documentary filmmakers began contacting him. What had once been a classified incident was becoming a documented historical event. In the early 2000s, Petrov appeared in international documentaries. Television interviews followed, including BBC, ZDF, and Scandinavian broadcasters. For many viewers, the revelation was unsettling. They learned that global nuclear war had not been prevented by technology, but by a human decision to question what a computer reported. Public recognition followed, but not from governments. Petrov received independent awards, the World Citizen Award, recognition from United Nations affiliated organizations, and honors from scientific associations in the United States. He was invited to universities and conferences to speak about nuclear risk, automation, and the limits of early warning systems. Petrov did not describe himself as a hero. In interviews, he spoke without drama. When asked about that night, his response was consistent. He said he was doing his job, nothing more. The applause came from the outside. The decision itself had already been made decades earlier. The recognition came late. It arrived when the Cold War was over, when the danger had become history. But the decision remained relevant, because the systems still exist, and the risks have not disappeared. Only the moment of that choice has passed. The story of Stanislav Petrov is not only about chance or individual courage. It is about systems where the final decision is meant to be made by machines, but still depends on humans. And about the cost a single mistake can carry inside a chain of automation. The Soviet early warning system was designed to remove human hesitation. Machines were meant to detect missile launches faster than people ever could. But that night, the machine was wrong, and the human was not. This is the paradox of automation. Technology speeds up reaction, but it also makes error instantaneous. A decision can become irreversible before anyone has time to ask why. This pattern is not unique. The Challenger and Columbia shuttle disasters were not only engineering failures, they were failures of risk culture. The Boeing 737 MAX crashes were tied to software systems designed to assist pilots, but which acted without transparency. In each case, automation reduced workload and increased vulnerability. Modern systems do not fail loudly. They classify a signal as an attack, a trajectory as dangerous, a sensor angle as incorrect. All of this happens while people increasingly trust what the system reports. Automation does not remove risk. It hides it until the last moment. Petrov was not rewarded for following orders perfectly. He was not an ideal officer by procedural standards. What mattered was that he hesitated. He did not blindly trust a red warning on a screen. He did not escalate the alert without questioning it. He did something no regulation could describe. He took responsibility and said no when it was easier to say yes. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What if someone else had been sitting at that console? Someone less confident, more exhausted, more formal. What if the shift had been different? What if the instruction to report immediately had seemed obvious? History often turns not on systems, but on who happens to be there when systems fail. The Petrov incident shows that in critical moments, the final safeguard is not the machine. It is the human who thinks. And that lesson has not lost its meaning, even today, as militaries deploy autonomous systems and decision-making is increasingly handed to algorithms. That night, there were no sirens, no headlines, no announcements. There was no celebration, no record of a world being saved. There was only a dark command room, an exhausted officer, a few red indicators on a console, and a decision no one noticed. No screen showed the alternative future, the one where missiles crossed the sky, where cities disappeared, where millions died without ever knowing why. That version of history exists only as a possibility. Never recorded, never documented. The world kept going. People woke up in the morning, went to work, turned on the radio. Trains ran on schedule. Cities breathed. Children went to school. Because somewhere outside Moscow, one person said, "There is no confirmation. We wait." Years later, he would be called the man who stopped a nuclear war no one knew about. Not because the war never existed, but because it remained a possibility, not a reality. In another scenario, there would have been no one left to explain what went wrong. This is not a story about heroism in a cinematic sense. It is a story about how fragile the world can be. Sometimes, that fragility rests on a single decision not to press a button. And the question remains, not for an answer, but for reflection. How many times in history has someone sat in front of a flashing warning, made a decision that shaped the future of millions, and we never learned their name.